if ever I'm not sure what I want to read or what to read next, I know I can go to these authors and I'm going to love it. Hey, ebook community. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about my favorite authors, my go-to authors, who have, some of them are newer to me, but they have risen over the past couple of years in a list of authors in a growing list of authors that I love to read and I want to continue to read. And I can honestly say that these are some of my favorite authors. It's not really a top 10 list and not really ranked, but just authors that I have grown to love, to read their stories and love their prose, and that I can honestly consider to be my favorite authors. So first on this list would be Bernard Cornwell. Now, Bernard Cornwell, he is an author that I just started reading last year for the first time, and I've only read one of his series. So far, I've only read The Warlord Chronicles, which is an Arthurian legend and just kind of going over the life of King Arthur, but not only that, but through the eyes of one of his faithful friends. And in that, I enjoyed it so much. And I couldn't wait to move on to the next book. I loved the first book. Then I read the second book, and it was even better. I thought that the second book may become one of my favorite books of the year. And then I read the third book, which was Excalibur, and it did end up on my top 10 list for the year. And so I enjoyed it so much, and I haven't moved on yet to read other series of his, but I've already purchased several of his other books that I know I'm going to be getting to quickly in this coming year. In fact, the Last Kingdom series by Bernard Cornwell is a series I really want to get to. I've already purchased a few of those books in anticipation. I actually had never seen these books. I had heard of them, but I've never seen them. And they're actually a lot smaller than what I thought they would be. So they might be pretty easy books to get through. So whenever I finish a big series, I may pick one of those up and read that, because I'm told that it's kind of a rinse and repeat story. You have a situation, you have the main character resolving the situation, and then it moves on back to that in the next book. So I look forward to that. That sounds great. Bernard Cornwell is on this list. Number 2 is C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis, I have read at least 10 of his books, and I'm pretty sure I've read more than 10, but some of those would have been his nonfiction back several years ago, and I didn't look at the list of what books I'd already read by C.S. Lewis prior to reading his fiction. So I've read The Chronicles of Narnia, which is very popular, probably his most popular books that he had written. In fact, I had read the first 3 several years ago and didn't move on past that. And then last year, actually the end of 2022, I read the first 5 books of that series, and then I stopped. I didn't read the last 2. And then this past December, I went ahead and finished the last 2, and I loved it. And also in November, I believe, between October and November, I read the Space Trilogy, which is a lesser known, you see my fly flying around in here, which is a lesser known series by him, but still very good. I encourage you, if you love the Chronicles of Narnia, then you need to pick up the Space Trilogy, because it's a little more adult in what it's dealing with. However, it's a science fiction book, and it's a science fiction series, and it's absolutely wonderful. So C.S. Lewis is one of my go-to authors, one of my favorite authors. Next on this list is a new author, in fact, an indie author from this year. If you are at all familiar with BookTube, then you know this author because you know his BookTube channel, and that is Philip Chase, the author of the Edan trilogy. And of course, I've only read it because he's only written 3 books at this point. But I read those this past year, and I loved them. I love Philip's prose. I love the way he thinks, is the only way I know how to describe it. The way he tells a story, the way he writes characters. I loved everything about it. In fact, I think I had minor complaints with The Way of Edan in book 1, very minor complaints. And I really didn't have many complaints or any complaints in the next 2 books. And I just love how he writes. In fact, I know he's going to be putting out This year he's going to be putting out another book, which it would be a sequel to the Adan trilogy. I don't know if it's going to be a standalone or the beginning of a series of books, but I know there's going to be a sequel book this year, and I so look forward to that. In fact, I also look forward to rereading the series through audiobook when Alan puts out the audiobook. So I look forward to that. So Philip Chase. Next on my list is pretty much anybody who puts out a fantasy or a list of their favorite fantasy authors. This one is going to be on it, and that is Robin Hobb. She's been called the First Lady of Fantasy. She's been called the Queen of Fantasy, and I have to agree with that. At this point, I have read 7 of the books of the Realm of the Elderlings series. I've read the first trilogy, Farseer. I've read the second trilogy, The Live Ship Traders, and I've read the first book of the third trilogy, which is Fool's Errand, and it's wonderful. One of my favorite authors who's going to be coming up later on in the list, I compare her to him with the way she writes characters. I love getting lost in character work. One of my favorite books, in fact, my favorite book of 2023 was Lonesome Dove, and the reason I love Lonesome Dove so much was just because of the characters. It wasn't even the story, and I know the story helped, but it wasn't so much the stories, it was just the characters and the how much you're introduced into just small things about them. And Robin Hobb does a great job with that. They don't even have to be doing anything. They can be sitting in a cottage somewhere or in a chamber or in a dungeon, and you are just engrossed in what she's telling you about these characters. So Robin Hobb is on this list of my favorite characters. Next on this list is a series that I absolutely binged last year. I don't remember the date of when the series started, but I didn't start it until last year. So I read the first book in January, the second book in February, and so on. The five books that was out, and then the 6th book released in July, and I read that, and that is Pierce Brown, the author of the Red Rising novels. And what can we say about this? Of course, you can talk about characters, as I already have. He writes wonderful characters. He writes wonderful the story that he's telling is wonderful. The conversation between the characters is spot on. His action is thrilling. I've loved everything about this series. I believe that they've gotten better as the books have gotten better as they've gone forward, with an exception of one. For me, I felt like one was not as good as the others, but it was still a wonderful book. That would be Iron Gold, which I would put last in my ranking of the Red Rising books. Not saying it's a bad book. It was a wonderful book, but I still put that last. But other than that, I think he got better with each book, ending with Lightbringer, which he put out this year, which was my favorite book of the series. And I know there's a lot of different opinions on what people's favorite books are. And no matter what book you say is your favorite, I will say, hey, you've got a good argument there, because they're all great. So Pierce Brown is on this list of my favorite authors, period. And next is one that I was comparing Robin Hobb to in the way she writes characters, and that is the master storyteller himself, Stephen King. Stephen King is an author that I was introduced to by my father. Now, I did not read any of his books earlier on. In fact, I didn't read any of his books until the end of 2022. But as far as his stories, my father loved to read his books, and so I was introduced to his movies. And my dad while we watched the movies, my dad would tell us, hey, this is how it's different in the books. This is what he does differently in the books. And so he loved it. So I loved Stephen King's stories from my dad. And then back in, like I said, the end of 2022, I began reading his books. I read, I think, one book, maybe two. And I think one book. And then in 2023, I read 10 books of Stephen King and quickly became one of my favorite authors. Now, there are things that I do not like about his writing. He sometimes says things and puts things in his books that to me is too crass for my taste, and I think it could have been just as good if he had not have done that. However, still, the stories that he tells, he is a master storyteller, master at character work, and I He is absolutely one of my favorite authors. Now, I said that this list is not ranked, and it's not ranked. You maybe could put Stephen King at number 2. So these last 2 books maybe a little ranked. The others were not ranked. I haven't considered who would be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, or anything like that. However, these last 2 books these last 2 authors with Stephen King would be pretty firm and pretty solid second. And for number 1 is, you probably already know if you've paid any attention to anything I've done on my videos, or if you've looked at the pictures of my bookshelf, and that is the professor himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, the author of The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and other tales that he wrote within that world. And even he wrote a lot of things that are not in that world that I haven't gotten to yet, but I plan to one day, because a goal of mine is to read everything that Tolkien wrote one day. So J.R.R. Tolkien, to me, was just the master. He was the best. I think fantasy is what it is today because of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to love him. That doesn't mean that that The Lord of the Rings has to be your favorite trilogy, or any of those books has to be your favorite book for me to... I say this because I've had conversations with people here recently who didn't like Tolkien, and they talk about how when they say they don't like Tolkien, that Tolkien fans come after them. Hey, I understand that, but you like what you like. But in my opinion, he's the best, and we are where we are in the fantasy genre largely because of him. And so I think that is not undisputed, but it's almost undisputed. Anyway, so he is my favorite author of all time. And that, not to say that these couldn't change, not to say, I hope in 2024, I hope that new authors are introduced to this list. I hope maybe some are bumped off. We'll see how it goes as we continue to read. But that's my list. That's my favorite authors. What about you? Who are your favorite authors? Who's your number 1 favorite author? Until next time, go read books.